Welcome to the Twinkle Talks EYFS podcast. Working in the early years is busy, funny, messy, and exhausting. Join me, Shána, some of the Twinkle EYFS team, special guest speakers, and other early years practitioners as we talk honestly about our experiences. Whether you're listening for CPD, on your commute, or to help you relax, Twinkle EYFS will share everything you need to know about all things early years. Hello, lovely listeners. It's Shána here from the Twinkle Talks EYFS podcast, here with another great episode for you. I'm really excited for you to hear this episode today because it is a definite hot topic within early years. Now, from my own experience as an early years teacher and from listening to you guys on social media, sometimes for our learners, phonics doesn't work. Now, why is that? What are the fundamental skills of phonics that do help us to learn to read and write? And what other strategies can we use when it doesn't? Well, I have got the best people to tell us the answers to these questions. I am joined by the wonderful Becki, who is the Twinkle Educational Content Lead for the Twinkle Phonics Scheme, and Emma, who is the Twinkle Educational Content Lead for the Originals books that we also get. So great expertise here from both of these lovely ladies. We're going to have a chat about all things phonics. So let's jump straight in. Emma and Becki, thank you so much for coming to have a chat with me today. How are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Wonderful.
I'm very excited about this episode. We don't want to ruffle feathers, but we definitely want to have a deep conversation about different points of view about how we learn to read and write into it. And this is kind of the point. So, and we're hearing it from the horse's mouth, as it were, at Twinkle. So for those of our lovely listeners who do not know Emma and Becki as much as I do, please introduce yourselves to our lovely listeners.
I'm Emma. I'm Emma Fitzgerald. I have worked on phonics and rhino readers, so I know a wee bit about phonics, but I'm currently the content lead of Originals for EYFS and Key Stage 1. So currently my focus is more on books to read aloud and reading for pleasure. Historically, I am an early years teacher as well. And when I'm not at Twinkle, I also work at my youth club for autistic children and young people.
Hi, I'm Becki. I'm the content lead for Phonics, focusing mainly on the training resources nowadays. And one of the co-creators of the Twinkle Phonics program. Before working at Twinkle, I was an early years and Key Stage 1 teacher in mainstream and SEND.
Okay, wow. I mean, the breadth of knowledge that we have just between you two, I think is pretty insane. Like the brains behind Originals, the brains behind the phonics scheme. Damn, this is great. Now, ironically, what we're going to be talking about today, ladies, is phonics doesn't work, does it? Now, that sounds like our listeners can't see that, but I'm getting very like, excuse me faces from Becki, and that's totally fine. But I don't know about you guys, but when I was teaching, I love phonics, always have, but there are always things that don't work for all children, right? And I did come across colleagues who said phonics just didn't work for me or doesn't work for my students. And it got us onto this conversation, didn't it, ladies, about actually, what are the reading and pre-reading skills, and what is the best way forward to teach children how to read and write. So I'll obviously start with you, Becki. I remember when I was at school, I didn't know we had a thing called phonics. I don't remember learning that we had phonics lessons, but it's something we definitely have as teachers now, and we do it for our learners. What impact does phonics have on reading development now that it's kind of this mainstream thing?
So phonics is kind of one of the fundamental skills that makes up reading. So all of the theory behind reading includes some level of decoding. I guess the discussion is kind of how that's delivered, whether that's kind of discreetly or whether that's kind of taught alongside other aspects of reading. The kind of reason that it's been pulled out and isolated kind of in most recent years is a lot to do with kind of working memory and like cognitive load, and the theory that we kind of need to focus on the different parts of reading with greater emphasis at different points in children's journey. So at the start of their reading journey, isolating the decoding part of reading. So ensuring that they have that systematic learning of the individual sounds in words, so that they can build up words with them, takes a lot of their working memory, and therefore they don't necessarily have the capacity to also be thinking about the comprehension of what they're reading at the same time as doing all that work on decoding. And so by isolating that and teaching that early on, they can get that automaticity in those skills to move to fluency, and therefore will then have that capacity in their working memory to be able to think about the other facets of reading.
Interesting. It's like freeing up some memory on your floppy disk, right? Like, because
Yeah,
there is a lot of
absolutely.
English to learn. I was going to ask you as well about that. We know as English is a very complex language. It's built from learning different decoding styles and spelling patterns from other languages too, which means some words, right, just cannot be relied on decoding. So how does phonics play its part there?
Yes, and there are as many rules in English as there are exceptions to those
Mm,
rules. I think what phonics gives you is a starting point to approach any word that you kind of come across. And it's something that you carry on using into adulthood as well, isn't it? That when you see a word that you haven't read before, that you go back to that phonics knowledge and thinking about the rules, and you then have to think about what the exceptions to those rules are. And so I think actually the way we approach common exception words in the Twinkle Phonics program is exactly in that way. We look at the bits that are following the rules, and then we look at the bits that aren't following the rules and learn what they're doing. Are they following? Are they still following a rule, but it's a rule that's kind of less common
mm.
that the children haven't learnt yet? Um, or is that word one, as you say, we've kind of pulled for another language, and there aren't very many words that also follow that rule in English, and so we just have to learn that kind of tricky bit of the word, but the rest is kind of making sense.
Mm. Okay, this is good. This is good. So phonics can dip in and out. It's like this is what you can, this is what you can't. But at least we're showing you what you can and can't, right? So
Yeah, and it means you can have a go at something.
exactly,
Um,
it gives you those
you're not
tools.
necessarily getting it right, but you feel like you've got some skills to be able to tackle it.
Yeah, okay, this is good. So then I suppose this is where you come in for me now, Emma. Becky was talking about the skills, right? Phonics is one of the skills of reading, but there's got to be many more than that. What are the other skills that children use? It can't just be phonics.
Well, I think one of the things that Becky was talking about was this how much of our working memory is used for what when we're reading. And I think that when children are decoding, when they're in those early reading stages, before they've developed fluency, before they've got automaticity, to borrow a lovely word from Becky, before they've got that, when they are in those decoding stages, when sort of every word is quite challenging. Becky's got a lovely diagram that you can't see, but I'll describe it. Basically, when they're decoding, there's a picture of a brain, and almost all of it is taken up with decoding. And
Yep.
then there's another brain for language comprehension, and there's only really a tiny bit of space for
Mm,
that. So when you're in that stage, when you're reading your little decodable books and you're sounding out sound by sound and blending, it's there's only a little bit of room really for understanding. And also, I think when you're decoding, because you're at that level, sounding out letter by letter, say cat, cat, even that takes a long time. You're not getting any access to higher level vocabulary, exciting words. So if we just think about what the children can decode using phonics, that is a very small um, number of words. Really, it's bigger than if they did sight words, but still, their vocabulary and what they can access themselves is quite limited. So where do they get the rest of the stuff. And how do you even decode a word and understand it if you've never heard it before, if you don't know that word? And that's where we need to get that vocabulary, we need to get that understanding elsewhere. So most people will be reading aloud to children, they'll be doing story time in class, but do we really understand sort of scientifically? Do we feel like if we had to explain as an expert what was going on there, what is the learning?
Mm.
Do we feel confident? I'm not sure as a teacher I would have, sorry. I would have known what I was doing was probably good, but did I understand on a deep level that just by listening to me, the children were learning to read? That's what I think people don't feel as confident in at the moment. I think there's such a focus on success that we can measure, and at the moment that is, based on phonics screening check. And phonics, very, very useful, obviously. But if we just use phonics, do children learn to read? I don't
Mm.
think they do.
Mm. So what other things then can we use for strategies for children as well as phonics to get the whole reading picture, as it were?
I mean, for me, I think it starts from, well, ideally as soon as a child is born. Just get right back in time. I think the main thing, I think, before they can read, they have to hear and know words, and that comes primarily through talking. When I say talking, I suppose as well, just to make clear that I'm talking about people who might communicate in other ways. So
Mm.
we might be talking about people who use sign language or other ways to communicate. When I say talking, I guess I'm talking about ways that you learn or experience vocabulary in whichever
Mm.
communication style that is. So when I say talk, yes, talk. So children will hear a lot of their vocabulary from the people around them as soon as they're born. And then by the time children start school, there's already usually a huge gap between the vocabulary that the children have. So I think if they're never read to, they know something like 4,000 words. But if they're read to every day, multiple times a day, they know, I don't know, over 1,000,000 or something. I should probably get the accurate data on that, but it's huge. The disparity between those things is huge. So I think that they need to hear words, and for me, I guess personally, one of the best ways to do that is reading aloud. And the benefits of hearing a book read is that, generally speaking, you will hear a wider range of vocabulary when listening to books than you might in everyday conversation. Your everyday conversation probably is going to be about your natural immediate environment, fridge, breakfast, for example. There's probably not going to be a tiger in the living room. You're more likely to get that from books.
Yeah.
And I think what's really fascinating again is thinking, we know that it's good to know words and we know that phonics is good, but how do they work together? I think I would have struggled to articulate that without a lot of the research that I've been doing more recently. I think as a teacher, I probably knew less about reading than I do now. I mean, I've got the luxury of having my job to do that research and to really understand how to make books, how to teach children to read, that perhaps I didn't as a teacher. So I think that knowing words is kind of the building block to being able to recognize and understand a word when you read it. Um, and the reading framework makes a really good example of that. That, for example, if children are being taught phonics and they've got, a small bank of sounds already, say phase two or level two, and they meet the word dog, they're more likely to read that and understand dog, feel satisfied, know, oh, I've read that word, I know what a dog is, I've seen a dog, I've heard of that word. But if they read a very similar word that takes the same decoding level, the same skill, and it's cog, for example, they might not have heard cog, they might not have seen a cog, they don't know what it is. They don't really know if they've read a word at the end of sounding it out. They might
Mm.
they might sound it out, blend it successfully, and be like, still don't know. So they don't feel like they've read anything. They can't possibly understand a word that they don't know. And that's where I think we really need to have that focus on oracy, I guess. Speaking is so important. If you hear a word and know it and have the opportunity for someone to show you it in context, you're much more likely to be successful and feel successful and actually enjoy reading when you come to decode it, blend it and go, ah, dog, right, got it. That's what reading does. You do this magic blending and sounding out that these teachers are teaching me. I know this magic code. Oh, and then it is dog. I know what a dog is.
Mm.
I think without that, children are just they can't read. They don't know what's happened at the end of that lovely blending hard work that they've done. They get no
Yeah.
satisfaction.
No, it totally makes sense.
So I was going to just say, going back to kind of what we were talking around with common exception words and kind of new vocabulary that maybe doesn't follow the rules. Actually, if you've got a breadth of vocabulary, you're going to have other cues to kind of to be able to read that word, because you're going to look at the sounds that you kind of know and those ones that maybe aren't following the rules and go, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, but actually I know this other word
Mm,
that is a real word. Maybe it's saying that.
mm. And I think you've brought up a really good point of like it's more than just doing one thing. So when I'm thinking about like reading as a whole, absolutely it is about learning the correspondence between a sound and how it's written. Absolutely. And then putting them together to make the words. But then also it goes bigger than that. You put the words together to make sentences. You put sentences together to make paragraphs because you are trying to tell a story of some sort, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, it is a form of communication. So it's about those different building blocks. And it's important to know that there's quite a lot of them, different types of building blocks to be learning to read. And I think the phonics scheme does that really well as well, about pre-reading skills. It's like before you even get into GPCs and learning about sounds and their graphemes, um what are the pre-reading skills? Do they, like you say, are they talking about things? Are they using communication? Are they able to understand rhythm and rhyme and alliteration and all of these things, all of these patterns that come with language? um and experience, like you say, Emma. Like if they have never come across a word before, they might be able to decode it and read it, but they have no idea what it means. And are they drawing upon other skills to do that? Perhaps, especially with children's books, are they looking at the pictures to get context? Is the context of the pictures helping them? Are they looking at the other words around them? Are they trying to figure out, well, this sentence wouldn't make sense if it was this kind of word, so it must be this word. The common example I always get is read and read spell exactly the same, and it looks the same on a page, and you can read it, but because you've read the other words around it in the sentence, you'd either change your pronunciation to "I will read the book" or "I have read the book," that kind of stuff.
And this is where I think that actually we have had we're realizing now, I think, that perhaps there hasn't been enough focus on those things, or maybe there has, but we've been so focused on the testing that it
Mm.
hasn't felt like we focused on them enough. And I think what you're talking about there, actually, Ofsted have picked up in their Telling the Story English Education Subject Report. I'm going to read a little quote, if that's okay.
Oh, please.
Knowledge of language, including vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, is part of the foundational knowledge needed for reading, speech, and writing. So I suppose I like that quote because it is talking about, well, what we were just saying about the building blocks, that foundational knowledge. And I think that is a really good example of actually phonics can't do all of those things. Well, I mean, can it? I suppose, Becki. A good phonics scheme won't just have letters being sounded out and blended with no context and no meaning, would it, Becki?
No, I think while most of the focus is on that decoding skills, you can still bring in elements of that. And actually, that's why Twinkle Phonics has a story-based approach. And those stories aren't there for the children to be reading, but they provide a context for that learning, and they contextualize all of the words that the children are reading. And actually, it starts to bring in some of those early comprehension skills in our applies. Often what they're reading or writing about is related to kind of what's been happening in the story, and so they've got to read or write what the kind of next thing that's going to happen or what the problem is or something. So it's starting that application of phonics into starting to read for meaning.
Yeah, and bringing in some of those other skills, because when you go to that apply section and they start to be able to write short captions, short sentences, I think they are thinking about syntax even in those early stages, aren't they? Because they're learning
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
a determiner like the or a comes before the noun and things like that, which again, you might not be thinking about that every time you do a phonics lesson, but it is in there. It is possible
Yeah.
to include it in your phonics teaching. I suppose a really good comprehensive phonics scheme that we want to work would be including, where possible, this foundational knowledge on top of just purely the sounds, I
Yeah,
suppose.
and it has to fundamentally still focus on the phonics, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that there's not that bit of capacity for those other things around it, um, and drawing those in where possible, and also kind of shifting the emphasis. At at the beginning of the program, it is going to be phonics heavy, although it's still drawing in some of those listening skills from pre-phonics as well. So it's still kind of working hard there. But as you move through the program, being able to bring in more of those other skills as the children are getting more confident and more fluent with their reading.
Mm. I'm really excited that Emma has said at least twice the word syntax because I am a language nerd. I did linguistics at uni. So I am probably more passionate about this than the average listener of this podcast, understandably, because for me, language skills is pre-reading skills. Like if we do not have functional communication, then reading and writing just seems impossible. And some of our listeners might have been listening and thinking, "What on earth does syntax mean?" And
Oh,
it's
yes.
things like this, right? So I didn't even know what syntax was until I went to uni and learnt it, and it's literally the structure of how words are put together to make sense. And I remember a really good example we did at uni, and it was like this. It's the order of adjectives. Have you guys heard of that? And it's like in English there's loads of different types of adjectives, but they come in a certain order, so it
Mhm.
makes sense to say big green dog, but it doesn't make sense to say green big dog. That just sounds weird, right?
I know that, but I pretty much have to Google it every time. I
Yeah.
can't It's not embedded knowledge. I know it's a rule, um, but yes, I need help pretty much every time.
Yeah, and it's like you can hear that it doesn't make sense, but
Mm.
that's something that I don't think phonics can teach. And it's that other
Mhm.
thing as well. And semantics. So semantics is like you say, it's about that comprehension. And that's why we have guided reading. That's why we have comprehension activities when the children get older. There's a wealth of things. And I feel like obviously you've probably noticed, ladies, that I've jumped here, but it's only because it fit is what we were talking about. It's those other skills around it all being used in tandem. But then it makes me think about, right, because there's so many different ways to learn how to read and different ways our brains process information and learn language. So did a podcast episode with a lovely lady who was talking about Gestalt language processing, which is essentially a different way of learning language, like a different way of learning phonics. So, the traditional or neurotypical way to learn language is to learn how to say the sound or learn the meaning of the sounds of words to be able to communicate. People with Gestalt language processing learn an entire phrase, learn an entire sentence, it's like a code, and then
Mm.
they go the other way. So they start with the big picture and they understand that first, and then the learning of the little bits break down later. And I've actually seen that style of learning within my reading, my reading journey with some of the children. It's that, like you say, on the surface they look like they can read because they've got their sight words or they know these big phrases and things, and they can read chunks of text, and it
Mhm.
is reading, but then they're learning the other codes later. So I wanted to know from your guys' perspective, as of course you have been teachers, and this is obviously your subject knowledge, like what does reading actually look like? What different ways are there to learn how to read?
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting from Becky and I are working together on a teach meet that we're preparing, and I think what's really interesting from that is that we're obviously both bringing different research, different knowledge and experience from our backgrounds, but also just things that we've lovely quotes, lovely facts that we think are very compelling. And I'm sort of just having a little look at hers and thinking, oh, well, I didn't know that actually. That would be really interesting to learn if I came to this teach meet. And one of those things is a lovely quote from someone called Dr. Martin Kozlov. I hope I'm saying that right. Um, if a child memorized 10 words, the child can only read 10 words. But if a child learns the sounds of 10 letters, the child will be able to read 350 three-sound words, 4,320 four-sound words, and 21,650 five-sound words. So I suppose you can memorize words, and some people maybe are more naturally inclined to do so than others. But even if you can do that, is that going to unlock as much of the language and all the words that are possible? It might limit you. And for some, maybe that's the level that they're at. Maybe I don't know, Becky. Maybe this is a good question for you. Does phonics work for everyone, or are there some people who just sight words is the way to go?
There are some children who seem to read by sight reading,
Mm,
and are very successful in learning to read by sight reading. But I don't think that that necessarily means that phonics isn't for them. I
mm,
think, as Shana's kind of touched upon already, that it's often they need to, once they've learnt to sight read, they kind of need to go back to the phonics,
mm,
because it's putting the sight reading is eventually going to put a ceiling on the number of words that they can read,
mhm,
and how far they can go with their reading and reading for meaning. And that going back to that foundational skill of phonics gives them those skills that they will allow them to kind of when they come across new vocabulary throughout life, that they're going to be using it. Adults aren't using their decoding skills every day when they're
mm,
reading. Most of the time, they have learned those words and are reading them by sight.
mm,
But they will still come across words that they're less familiar with, whether that's because it's more technical vocabulary and things, that they're going
mm,
to pull back to their phonics knowledge
mhm.
to at least start to have a look at what that word is.
And obviously there are some words that you have to learn by sight, really. I mean, obviously when what we were talking about earlier is even with those tricky words, you will focus on the bits that are recognizable. Like in could, you know the C and you know the D. It's the middle bit that's a bit different to what you might expect. But then with words like the, I do think you kind of just have to learn them by sight, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I mean the is used in
Yes,
other
it does have
words.
the TH. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but the kind of schwa at the end.
You start learning the before you know the TH,
Absolutely,
grapheme and
yes.
phoneme, right? Yeah.
So at that point, that whole word is tricky, and it's only, yeah, later in your journey
Mm.
that you learn some of the bits do occur in other words as well.
Mm,
I think a really good like conversation as well, and I'm sure you guys have had it when you were in your early years classrooms, is one of the statements. I'm not sure if it's even in the new statements anymore for the development matters, but I would definitely remember it when I was a teacher about identifying common logos and recognizing that kind of stuff. So
mm,
if someone sees a big yellow M on a red background, they know what that means, or if they see a common logo for a TV show or a game or something, the
mm.
children can identify that. Is that still reading?
Is it reading or is it recognizing color and shape?
But isn't that
Can
what
we
reading
call it
is?
reading?
Isn't that what reading is? We're recognizing shapes of letters and giving them meaning.
Yes.
They're just recognizing shapes and colors and images and giving them meaning. Oh, what have I done? Have I thrown a spanner in the
I
works?
was going to just say that if they, just because they can read it from recognizing the logo, does that mean if you stripped away that logo, they would still recognize that word?
That's exactly what I was just thinking. What if we turned a familiar red and yellow, for example, I won't say what logo I could possibly thinking of, a big red and yellow logo that lots of children like. What if we change that to purple and green?
Yeah,
Would they then lose the ability to read
yeah,
that word? No one can
exactly.
see my finger quotes there, but, for the listener, I did air quotes.
Or like similarly, like you say, if we still used a red and yellow background but changed the letter, would they
Mm,
still think that it is that logo? It's really intriguing. Like, at
mm,
what level is what does reading look like? Because of course, if you go down to the basic level, it is looking at shapes of marks and making
Mhm.
sense of them. But
Mm.
then is that just pre-reading?
I think it's definitely they're doing something because if we think that reading is understanding that this code, I suppose, which we call letters, holds meaning,
Mm.
then they are doing that because
Yeah, they're
they're
decoding.
seeing some code and thinking, I know that has a meaning. It means I might be able to get my favorite food there. For example, just as a random example. Um, but is that quite reading? I'm not sure I could confidently go as far as to say it's reading.
I think I would argue probably it's not, because
Mm.
would they be able to, as we said, take that and put it in different contexts? And I think
Mm.
one
Mm,
of the key things in learning to be able to read and unlock the alphabetic code is being able to utilize all of that knowledge and apply it in
Mm.
different situations, isn't it? You know,
Mhm.
you see the letter A in the word cat, and you see it in the word bag, and you recognize it's the same letter, and
Mm.
it's going to make the same sound.
I think that's a really good word that we were, yeah, looking for, isn't it? That can they apply it elsewhere? So maybe we can agree it's pre-reading, which I think is a very useful stage.
Oh,
mm,
absolutely. And without those pre-reading skills, then often reading doesn't happen. You see so often that children, in reception, even year one, year two, they know the sounds but they can't blend. And
Mm.
actually, a
mhm,
lot of those problems stem back to their pre-reading skills,
Mhm.
and actually, they're not able to isolate the sounds in words when
mhm,
they're listening to them, and therefore they're not kind of ready for doing the blending
mm,
with letters. Um,
yeah,
because yeah, we always talk about if you can't recognize that a cat meows and a dog woofs, then you're not ready for reading,
yeah,
because that recognition of that sound relating to that animal is kind of
Mm.
a precursor to then hearing an ah, or hearing the word cat and being able to hear the k at the beginning, the t at the end, and then
mm,
eventually the ah in the middle.
yeah. It's why we do lots of listening walks, isn't it? And because we
Yeah.
need the children to also be in tune and process that communication skill, that language skill, whether it be hearing for our hearing children or communication boards for our non-hearing children or non-verbal children. It's if you were going to go on a learning walk and hearing is your, I don't want to say key, main way of absorbing information about communication, if they can't tell the difference between a bird tweeting and a motorbike, they're not going to be able to hear the difference between two different letters or two different sounds,
Mm.
speech sounds.
Mm.
So that's an interesting one.
Absolutely. And when I'm explaining, in training and things, about the importance of level 4 or phase 4, which obviously kind of comes at the end of their reception journey, I refer back to those pre-reading skills, because actually what that level focuses on is more complex word structures where you get the two consonants next to each other. And then that comes back to the listening skills, because if you think of words like tree and how often children spell that with a ch
Yeah.
rather than
Mm.
the tr,
Mhm.
and it's about them being able to hear those different sounds,
Mm.
and isolate them within a word. And that's why that level of phase of phonics is really important, because it's drawing through those listening skills and applying them to those complex word structures.
It's a lot.
Just thinking about the example of maybe just a random example of a favorite restaurant that a child might enjoy, just as one example. I'm just thinking about the power of that, I suppose, as well in terms of motivating readers. I think one of the main ways that I think a child or their adult being aware, I suppose, of print or words in the environment is that we understand the point of reading more when that happens. I think if you'd never understood that, for example, this word will take me to my favorite restaurant, or when we look at this sign, it helps us get to the park or whatever it does, and someone just sat you down and said, we're going to do phonics now, and it's really, really hard work, you
Mm,
could just be like, "Oh my god, no thanks. This is really
yeah.
annoying. I don't wanna do any of this. It's really hard and I'm tired." But if you have you kind of have to have an understanding of the end result, I think, that if I do this, I'll unlock, and that can be, I think, the joy of listening to a fantastic story. If you've had that modeled to you at home, your parents, your carers, your adults in your lives, they've got this magic skill where they can bring this entertainment to you through this story. But also, they know how to read instructions to build a piece of furniture that you want for your bedroom. Seeing it in your life around you, I think is very useful for that, just making you realize why you should want to do all this hard work of learning phonics.
I agree. I was just about to say, I remember looking back, and I do think the phonics scheme does this really well at Twinkle. Is, like the old Biff, Chip, and Kipper books and things like that when you used to learn how to read at the beginning. They probably were the phonics of our time, but oh my goodness, were the stories boring. Like, Chip sits, Chip can run, Chip. And I was like, okay. And then, as a child, that's not really exciting. Yes, of course, it's functional and it makes sense. And you're learning these skills, but the power of stories and the exciting vocabulary and being exposed to those stories like the originals where it is got way loads more vocabulary in there is going to be appealing.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? That I think the phonics scheme, the story PowerPoints, they are story based, and I think our decodable reading scheme, we do as much as possible to make
Yeah.
them enjoyable and great for reading for pleasure. But at the same time, if we just take the example of those early decodable books, and this is no shade because I wrote some of them, we do the very best we could with very, very limited sounds that the early readers know. But there's only so much you can do with,
Yeah.
6 pages and 6 sounds or whatever it is.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, because in the phonics scheme that we have the mini books which follow the weeks, and
Mhm.
so that
Yeah.
that first week, the mini book has it, it's about Pat, and you pat and
And then she
Pit
just pat,
pat.
pat again.
and Pat sat
Mhm.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
because they know by the end of that week they know four sounds, and
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
only so much you can do with that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's recognizing those limitations, but like you say, bringing other things in. And sometimes, you know what? There are limitations. You got to start somewhere. You can't throw
Mm,
everything at the children at once. So start somewhere and, do other things where you can. The thing that I think is tricky for educators in this is the assessment side, right? I
mm,
think I think it's quite tricky for reading specifically as a subject to assess because there are so many different things. Like the phonics screening, I
mm.
think is always pretty a controversial kind of subject to talk about. So
Absolutely.
yeah, tell me about assessments for these. Like, how do we measure the success for reading as a whole? Like, what makes a successful reader? How can we assess that?
I do think it will be really interesting actually, Shána, to see. I know there's what's is it called, just the assessment review, or is it the curriculum and assessment review?
Yeah, curriculum assessment review.
Thank you, the curriculum and assessment review. So it's being looked into. There'll be some, report, some big change coming. And what will the assessment of reading look like? I think, in my opinion, the focus has been perhaps too much on phonics. What other areas of reading might be assessed? But then, if someone to ask me, okay, Emma, what do you think should be included? How do we measure reading for pleasure? How do you assess that? I don't know, actually.
It's
Um,
so hard, isn't it?
yes. I'm not saying we shouldn't have phonics screening, but I think it's maybe we've been overly reliant on that as a measure of
I think
success.
we definitely have been over reliant on it, and I think it was really interesting. So we run a research project, we have done for the last 2 years, and when we were analysing the data from last year from our research schools, there was quite a significant discrepancy between the number of children who'd passed the phonics screening and whether they were at kind of age-related expectation
Mm.
with the phonics assessments. And that discrepancy was that more children were passing the phonics screening than were at age-related expectations with the general phonics
Mm,
assessments.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think maybe there is some coaching and things going on to kind of support children with the phonics screening. We don't assess in the Twinkle Phonics program whether they can read pseudo words. We only look at real words, and actually the whole program doesn't include pseudo words. We have resources to support that, but they are separate phonics screening resources because we think it's really important that children are giving meaning to what they're reading.
And I think that can sometimes be a hindrance for some children who really look for meaning in words.
Yes.
It's almost like the ones that really understand or really committed to that fact that when you decode, you should understand what you've got at the end, but will
Yeah.
sometimes try to self-correct and make a guess at the end, and then maybe kind of shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you always hear the stories of the child in the year one class who is a fluent reader who doesn't get full marks on the phonics
Yeah.
screening where they're absolutely capable of it. And often that is because they are ascribing meaning to the pseudo words because they
Mhm.
are nearly another word, and they're using all of those things that we've taught them, particularly around words that tweak it, adjusting the pronunciation if it doesn't sound quite right, and things like that.
And also, we're taught, aren't we, that words carry meaning. So
Absolutely.
it just seems counterintuitive to put children in a test to say, right, you can read this word, but does it mean something? They're 6. They don't know all the words in the world. It might have a meaning. I remember doing some, I don't know about you guys, but I remember doing some like practice tests or just exercises to get them ready for the phonics screening. And then I'm confidently going, yeah, that's an alien word. That's not a real word. And then it turns out it is a real word. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was a real word. Sorry. Like it's a really niche, like a Scrabble word. It's probably a Scrabble word. And I'm just like, but that's got nothing to do with their reading skills. That's just to do with experience. They haven't come across the word, like you said before, Emma.
And when we were creating the phonics screening resources, like it was an absolute minefield
Yeah.
making sure that our pseudo words were actually pseudo words, but they also have to follow the rules of English, and so you can't just throw 3 letters together
Mhm.
and say that's a word.
Mm,
Um, they have to follow some rules, but they also can't be actual words. And
Mhm.
yeah, as you say, like Scrabble words, and even kind of slang words and things,
yeah.
Mhm.
that can be very tricky.
Like sus. Can you imagine if sus came into a phonics screening? Yeah, it's a real word. It's not in the dictionary though, babes.
But just thinking it as well about I suppose, what do we think reading success actually is? I think one thing that's been quite stark is the National Literacy Trust. They released this kind of summary of their research in 2024. And just 1 in 3 children and young people said that they enjoyed reading in their free time.
Oh.
So only a
Really
third of
sad.
our children are
Yeah.
even enjoying it. So we might have, what is it, something like 80% or something pass the phonics screening test.
Yeah.
But how many of them are enjoying it? How many of them are we setting up to want to read for future reading success? I don't know if we're getting that right.
Mm, I agree.
And I think another thing that's interesting as well is what happens after year one, the
Yeah.
phonics check, because
When they
um,
finish phonics,
yeah, when they
Mm.
finish phonics. Um, I'm just looking at some stats here. In year one, 21% did not meet the expected level. So year one, 2023, 21% did not meet the expected level in the phonics screening check. But then if we look at year six, 27% did not meet the standard in reading. So that's higher.
Mm.
Um, and it says in the end of Key Stage 1 results, 32% did not meet the expected standard for reading. So
Gap's
they're
getting
getting worse.
wider.
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
And what's going on there? Is it to do with the motivation? Is it to do with reading for pleasure? Is it the fact that we're not focusing enough on all the skills they need?
No, I think one of the things is maybe what I alluded to when you're saying we finished phonics is actually
Mm.
phonics doesn't finish at the end of year one.
Yeah.
Mm.
What the phonics screening assesses is still quite limited in terms of grapheme phoneme correspondence that you are exposed to in the English language. And if you do stop there, then your reading fluency isn't going to gain momentum because there are still so many GPCs that you are going to come across that you're not secure in. Actually, while it's not going to be taught in the same discrete fashion with as much emphasis, that learning needs to carry on, into year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because it also feeds into the spelling as well, so that they can unlock it with the decoding, so that then they can get onto, as you say, the reading for pleasure. Because if you've passed the phonics screening, you still can't access every book that there
No.
is.
Yeah.
You can't just go to a library and pick up any book in the children's section. And so how can you learn to love reading on your own if you can't access them?
We have delved, ladies. We have delved today. There's a lot. I mean, this is just a little taster of what's to come, because I know you're doing a Teach Meet on this. And in case you didn't remember, or in case you didn't know, lovely listeners, our Twinkle Teach Meets all are free, right? They're free to join, free to come and have a listen to. And you're going to be talking about this topic more, right?
Yes, we might not remember everything that we've talked about today, but we're certainly going to be talking on this theme for sure. We've got some wonderful slides, some more research, some more interesting quotes, and also lovely visuals, which we obviously can't be delivering today.
Absolutely not. So I encourage all to join the conversation, and I'll put the link to your Teach Me in the episode description as well, talking exactly about phonics. And I always encourage as well, if you're listening to this and you've still got questions, or you've still got points about, you know what, phonics just doesn't work for my children, or you know what, no, we need to do phonics in year 6 as discrete learning, please write in. You know where to come and find us. I'll pitch them to Emma and Becki and see what they have to say. I did have a conclusion question, but I'm not sure if we can answer it. Maybe the Teach Meet will answer it. Does phonics work then? Does it work for everyone? And what should we as educators be doing?
My opinion would be that we can't rely solely on phonics to teach our children to read.
I think actually I would agree with Emma that it isn't the be all and end all. It is really important, and all children having some fundamentals of phonics in their knowledge, I think, means that it works for all in some way, shape, and form. But there is more than phonics in terms of learning to read, and most importantly, loving reading.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm not just saying this because I'm biased and I work with you guys, obviously. But the fact that you guys are talking about this and you are like the content leads of these areas brings me so much joy and like reassurance that the Twinkle Phonics scheme and the Twinkle Originals content that we have supports all of that. You know, it's like you're aware of everything that is encompassed within reading. So you've built a succinct, systematic, quite rightly blooming wonderful phonics scheme, and you've also got the most gorgeous originals books that will help solve this education problem, as it were. And I know in the Teach Meet that you'll be giving loads of advice on how to use those schemes, how to use the books to support children to become overall successful leaders, right?
Absolutely. As well as that Teach Meet, we have actually got a few others going on at the moment that are a bit more about how to develop your whole school approach to reading and how to support all learners with reading. And that touches on helping children with SEND, for example, and also how you might be able to help your readers catch up. I think for me, one of the mistakes perhaps that some of us make is thinking phonics didn't work in year 1, out the window, it must be something else. But actually that isn't necessarily true. It might mean that they need a different approach to their phonics teaching. They might need interventions, but older children need phonics if they haven't got it already. And I think, yeah, we'll be looking a bit at that and what else your readers who are behind or are learning differently might need. So yeah, have a look at some of our other CPD events and come and join us. Ask us questions. Bring your own information as well if you've got some. We'd love to learn from you as well.
Wonderful. Right then. Well, I'll let you go then, ladies, and go and prepare for these wonderful teach meets that you have. And I'll go and see what questions all of our followers have, and I'll come bombard you with them and start the conversation again. It's been so lovely to have you. Thank
This has
you.
been so interesting. We should do this again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Look, we'll do another catch up and be like, right.
Do you know what I'd love to talk about actually one time is
Yeah.
comparing reading in England with other countries. So I think what we'll need to do is just put in a request for us to have maybe like a trip around the world, doing some
Oh,
research for the listener, and then we'll come back and present our find. Yeah, I think we'll put
but
that in, and then
this look, the people want to know this information. We need to go to the Bahamas. Yeah.
so we'll
Yeah.
go and do that, and then listeners, we'll see you in a year after our around the world reading research trip.
With our wonderful tans. Yeah. We will do that sacrifice for the listeners, for the people. I
For the
love
listener,
this.
for the listener. Ultimately for the children.
Oh, you went there, Emma. Oh, you went there. Oh,
I'm
lovely
only
ladies.
thinking of the children.
Of course you are. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day and have lovely teach meets. I'll see you there.
Yeah, hopefully we will. See you. Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma and Becky, for joining me. That was a really interesting conversation, and it doesn't stop there. As you probably heard, Becky and Emma are going to be hosting a free Teach Meet. So it's on Eventbrite. You can join, don't have to pay anything. And they're going to be talking about phonics in more detail, and we would love for you to join in the conversation. So I have put the link to the free Teach Meet, Phonics Doesn't Work, in the episode description. And also, if you've got some ideas or comments or experiences about phonics teaching and reading strategies, do get in contact. All of our social media handles are in the podcast description as well. We would love to hear your thoughts on phonics teaching and reading and writing strategies. But until the next episode, I hope you have a lovely day. See you soon. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you would like to join in or would like to know more, then come and find us on our social media sites. We have a Facebook page, Facebook groups, an Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube. All the links of where to find us will be in our podcast description. Come and join the conversation. And whatever you're doing today, I hope you have a great day.